Hello, it's Chino here. If you like aggressive openings, you're in the right place. Today I would be looking at the second of the two-part series on the 4 pawns attack against Aлекhine's defense. So after the opening moves e4, knight f6, e5, chasing the knight, knight to d5, d4, d6, which is typical of black in this position, c4, harassing the knight once more, knight b6, pawn to f4. We have the main position, or the starting position of the 4 pawns attack. So in this position, black would usually play pawn takes e5. Just going back one move, is worth noting that sometimes black plays this move bishop to f5 first, but it typically transposes to the variations we'll be looking at. So after pawn takes e5 and pawn takes e5, the move we looked at in part 1 was this move, pawn to c5, but in most of the lines we looked at, well, pretty much all the lines, white kept an advantage. The better move, but still a difficult one for black, which we'll see, is knight to c6. Now the point is the knight is putting pressure on this pawn, on the d4 pawn, and note that for example, pawn to d5 isn't possible because of knight takes e5. Okay, so after this move, white would usually play bishop to e3, defending a pawn. It's worth noting knight to f3 was also possible, but black would gain some counterplay with bishop to g5 if knight to f3, renewing the threat on the d4 pawn. Anyway, after bishop to e3, bishop f5, and we see that move again, but usually follow because black wants to play e6 and ensure the bishop is outside the pawn chain. So yeah, bishop f5, knight to c3 just continues developing for white, and pawn to e6, and only now does white play knight to f3. Okay, so the main line goes bishop to e7, but just worth pointing here, if black were to waste a move on bishop to g4, the point being that if bishop takes f3, pawn would have to capture because of this pressure on the d4 pawn. Well, if black plays this move, white can just simply play bishop to e2. And if black were to continue with his idea, bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3 would follow. And even after black plays this typical move, queen to h4 check, bishop to f2 would block the check, queen to f4 trying to put pressure on the position. But here white would just simply play pawn to c5. Typically, this knight will come to d5 because if he goes to d7, well, queen to c1 will follow, exchanging the queens. And we'll see a similar idea here, but after knight d5, knight takes d5, and pawn takes d5. This idea again of exchanging queens is what would typically be played by white. And after continuations like g6 and f4, and maybe this bishop to h6 threatening to win the pawn, and bishop to e3, I think we can stop here. The main thing to note here is white has a big space advantage in the position. Has this possibility of playing h4 to h5, and just has the easier game in general. White can also play on the queen side with a3, b4 if the conditions allow it. But yeah, so this it's playable for black, but it's a much better position for white. Okay, so going back to the main position after knight to f3, so we just looked at bishop to g4, etc. And bishop to e7 is the more usual reply. And now in this position, there have been two key moves for white. So one is d5, and the other one is bishop to e2, which is my preference. I'll just point out quickly that d5 leads to very messy positions that usually tend to end in draws. I'll just show you a quick sample line. So after d5, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5. Knight to b4 is a little bit problematic for white because black's threatening to win a pawn on to win the d5 pawn. He's got 3 pieces on a pawn versus white's 2. And we also see that there's this threat of knight to c2 check. So usually white is forced to play something like knight to d4, but then after bishop to d7, white still has to worry about this. I think the main line goes something like pawn to e6, pawn takes e6, pawn takes e6, bishop to c6, when white usually would try knight takes c6, and after pawn takes c6, and play something like queen to f3, threatening checkmate. It gets very messy, and I'd say it's probably a little bit a tad better for black. I mean, the other thing to note as well is there is this possible threat of knight to c to check in the balance. But anyway, not wanting to go into that, if we just go back to the main position after bishop to e7, yeah, d5 I don't think gives white an advantage. It just gets very messy, and black should be okay. So the move I recommend is bishop to e2, and I think that's, well, I've had a look with some engines, and that's the top move from the engines that I've tried analyzing the position with. Okay, so what to play for black? So castle's kingside is the main line. There's not much. There's no point discussing alternatives. And then castles for white. And now black has to do something about this pawn chain in the center. Otherwise, he'll just be doomed to a passive position. So f6 is the typical move. Or it's important to note, anytime you're playing against a big pawn center, you should always have a go you know, at chipping away at the pawn center, and that's what black tries to do here. But this has its downsides, as we'll see. So after pawn takes f6 and bishop takes f6, we see that black ends up with this, if you like, isolated pawn on e6. I mean, it's not critical at the moment because white can't get in at it, but it's a long-term disadvantage. Anyway, the move that's been played quite often for a long time and is the top choice amongst club players is this queen to d2. But in more recent time, the move pawn to b3 has come to the fore and scores well for white. Now I need to point out something. The positions we get tend to be a little bit more positional, with a few tactical nuances in this particular setup, as we'll see. So yeah, so I mean, typical for black here would be to play queen to e7, you know, just planning to play a rook to d8, centralizing pieces and developing. And then now the key move for white in this position is bishop to d3. So white's trying to, I mean, this bishop has a very good position on this b1 h7 diagonal, and white's trying to challenge you know, the, if you like, the strength of this bishop on the diagonal. Yeah, so here black played rook a to d8. It's just what pointing out that, yeah, bishop takes d3 was possible from black, but after queen takes d3 and say rook a to d8, knight to e4 would be a good move. White wants to win this bishop, perhaps not straight away, but you know, at some point in the near future. And yeah, this position will end up being better for white after he centralized pieces with rook to d1, etc. Okay, just going back to the position after bishop to d3, black didn't fancy taking on d3. Perhaps preferring for white to capture on d3, so he can get rid of this isolated pawn. But let's see what happens. So yeah, after bishop to d3, black played rook to a to d8 instead, and then now white continued with bishop takes f5, and after e takes f5, queen to f4. So yeah, just thinking about this position for a second, white's pieces are developed on very good squares. This either of these rooks can occupy the d and e files or the e and f files. I mean, white is for choice here. But the important thing to note as well, and this is important for an endgame, is this queenside pawn majority. If imagine all the pieces being off the board and just the kings and pawns facing off against each other, this queenside pawn majority would be a little bit of an advantage for white. Okay, so after queen to d2, black tried a neat, a little trap, but yeah, white wasn't going to fall for it. So yeah, after pawn to f4, the move that's been played often in this position is bishop to f2. So yes, just probably worth pointing out here that we're now following the game Gomez, Gallen, Orenzi versus Matrish. It's an email game from 2015. So after bishop to f2, black in this game played pawn to g5. So just something else to point out in this position. If you notice, the only way for black to gain counterplay against the white position is to move the kingside pawns, which is a bit counterintuitive because at the same time he's trying to counterattack, he's weakening his king position. So this, I mean, just the sight of this should, arouse your suspicions about the, validity of, this type of approach. Anyway, rook to a, rook a to e1 was played by white, threatening the queen, and queen to g7 followed. So notice that here, white is, I say white, black is putting a fair bit of pressure on this d4 pawn with one, two, three, four pieces against white's tree. And white came up with a tactical nuance, which was knight to e4. Now, the tactical nuance here is that black can't really win a pawn with knight takes d4 because of this intermediate move, knight takes f6 check. And then at once after queen takes f6, bishop takes d4, white would just end up a piece up. So if we just go back to the position after knight to e4, so we see knight takes d4 is impossible, but black could probably win a pawn after bishop takes d4. But the problem with this move is that after knight takes d4, black would have lost a very important piece. That bishop is very important for the development of the, of the king. Anyway, if we go back to the game, so after I think it was queen to g7 and this clever move, knight to e4, and black not wanting to give away his f6 bishop, just calmly played bishop to e7. But then this just allowed white to continue with pawn to d5, ignoring this threat of bishop to b4. I think we need to give this an exclamation mark, and we'll see why in a minute. Now, according to the engines, instead of the move that was played in the game, bishop to b4, g4 was a better try, but the analysis still shows white has an advantage after, say, knight to d4. If black would continue with bishop to b4, but then now white has this knight to c3, move available, but still, with an advantage. A sample continuation could be something like knight to e7, but then after something like pawn to a3, Bishop takes c3 would give away this important bishop, which we talked about before, and the other move, bishop takes a3, would lose the exchange after knight to e6, threatening both rooks and the queen. Okay, so going back, so after the move pawn to d5, black played bishop to b4. Note in this position, white doesn't have knight to c3 to block. But white just simply played queen to e2, allowing black to win the exchange. And you got to take a look at this position and think, well, what's white got for the exchange here? And again, it's this complicated thing of how do you assess compensation in chess? Well, I think for one, the important thing to note here is this knight, white has a tempo here, so this knight has to move. So that's a tempo to start off with. One of these pawns, this G pawn is vulnerable and it's going to fall. And black also has to be careful of a knight, appearing on e6 in some variations. Okay, in the game, white tried knight to e5. And after knight to e5, we saw knight takes e5 from white and queen takes e5. And now this move, queen to threatening to win this pawn on g6, on g5, sorry. Black had nothing better than to go, I think it was queen to g7. I mean, that pawn's going either way. One try, other try for black could have been rook to f5, defending this pawn a second time, but this clever move, little move here, g4, would make sure white wins, at least a pawn. Okay, so if en passant, this special move, then knight takes g3, attacks both the queen and the rook, and white would regain the exchange as well as have an attack against this weakened king position. So yeah, just going back to the position, yeah, we've just seen rook to f5 isn't good, so queen to g7 happened, setting a little trap, but I think white had everything in control. So the trap was that after knight takes g5, black intended to pin, this knight to the queen with rook to f5. But unfortunately for black, the tactics work well for white in this position. So rook e8 check happened first, to which black had to respond rook f8. It's just worth pointing out here that rook takes e8 wasn't possible, because after queen takes e8 check, if queen to f8 trying to swap down, swap pieces, then queen to e6 check would follow, because king h8 would just simply be met by bishop to d4 and on white's winning. So going back to the position after rook to e8 check, so rather than capture on e8, black went back rook f8, and now white has to be careful. So if you notice, this back rank is a bit weak. A queen check on a1 would be devastating, so it's important this rook doesn't capture on d8, for example, or keeps an eye on this back rank. So to do that, white just quietly played rook to e6, keeping the rook on an active position, as well as defending the back rank. So for example, now if queen to a4 check, bishop to e1, or even rook back to e1 would stop the check. So yeah, after rook to e6, black came back with rook to f5, again trying to pin this knight. But I think the difference now is that white has this move, pawn to h4, so creating an escape for the king from this back rank, and also keeping an eye on this rook e8, and yeah, and even this possibility of going rook e to h6 if the circumstances allow. Okay, so after this move, black I mean, look at black's position. What active move can you play as black? You can move the knight, you can move a rook, but what active move do you have? It's a terrible position. I mean, the rook can't even come here because of rook takes rook. And I have to say, queen takes here. Queen takes h7, check with checkmate to follow. Next move. So, I mean, just looking at this position, what it's funny how black is an exchange up in the position. I mean, he's down a pawn, but he's still an exchange up for a pawn. Yeah, but he can't find any useful moves. He tried knight to d7. And after knight to d7, we might just play the quiet maneuver, which was queen to d1. And the possibility here was to go, you know, queen to d3 in some lines, attacking this rook, or even playing bishop to d4, attacking the queen. So in the game, to try and relieve his position, black gave back the exchange with rook takes g5. But let's see what happened if he tried to say something like bishop to f8, attacking this knight, this rook rather on e6. Well, I think white would just have played bishop to d4, and you see the queen doesn't have any useful positions to go to. I mean, even if black were to try something like rook f times takes d5, pawn takes d5, and rook takes d5, hoping to trap this bishop to the, I say trap this bishop, win this bishop because of this pin. Again, the tactics work better for white because white could just calmly go rook to e8. The point being that something like rook takes d4, surprisingly, queen to e1 is winning for white. And you're probably wondering how is that even possible? But I think the key point here is, let's say rook to d7. If that happens, knight to e6, threatening the queen and threatens to win this. So yeah. Just going back to the position after queen to d1. So yeah, in this position, black tried to give back the exchange just to relieve the pressure because we saw the problems he'd run into after bishop to d4. But then after queen takes g5 and queen to e2, now the materials are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns versus 5, rook versus rook, knight versus bishop. The materials are about equal, but the black king is a bit more vulnerable than the white king. Black tried knight to f8, but then after rook to e5, harassing the queen, and queen to f6. Bishop to d4 was a strong move. And there's all sorts of discovered threats here. I mean, rook to e4 is a strong threat. Even queen here, check first, rook here, and then winning a pawn. Black tried rook to d7, but then after queen to e4, perhaps threatening rook to f5, rook to f7 stopped rook to f5, rook to e8, trying to penetrate on the back rank and attacking the queen at the same time. The queen had to go to g5. I mean, black is in a bit of trouble here. Queen to e5, queen takes e5, bishop takes e5. Ended up being a technical win for white in the position. The point here is black doesn't have too many useful moves. In the game, he played to relieve the pressure on the c7 pawn. He played c6, but then after d6, I mean, this outside pass pawn is telling. F3, pawn takes f3, rook takes f3. There was no stopping, you know, pawn to d7 with the queen, and white won this one comfortably. So yeah, if we were to recap, So if we go back to the key position in the 4 pawns attack, Alekhine's defense, after pawn takes e5 and pawn takes e5, knight c6 is the more popular try for black in this position. But yeah, white gets an advantage by just simple development and being careful not to fall into any traps. So even after e5, knight f3 and bishop e7, just bishop e2. This is my preferred approach instead of the move d5, which has been played a lot more often. So yeah, the other thing I think worth noting in this game is after the main moves, castles kingside and castles kingside, and black trying to undermine the center. The other key move I think we saw in this game was pawn to b3, as opposed to the more or the previously more common queen to d2. It just gives white a solid, position where the tactics work in white's favor. And whenever black tries to undermine the pawns in the center. So yeah, this was part 2 and the final in the series for the 4 pawns attack. I hope you enjoyed this one, and please don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hope to see you on the next one.